Sometimes, horror doesn't come from an ancient grave or a historical tragedy. Sometimes, it finds you in your ordinary rented home. In 1974, paranormal investigators in California received a case that would haunt them forever. It wasn't a haunted house. It was a woman being hunted by ghosts. The year was 1974, and in the sprawling suburbs of Culver City, California, a cry for help echoed from an unlikely source. Dr. Barry Taff and his partner, Kerry Gaynor, both researchers at UCLA's parapsychology lab, were accustomed to strange calls. They had investigated countless claims of ghostly apparitions and phantom noises, approaching each with a healthy dose of scientific skepticism. But the call they received that day was different. It came from a local bookstore, where an employee, unnerved and out of her depth, relayed a story so disturbing it bordered on the unbelievable. The story belonged to a woman named Doris Bither, a single mother living a difficult life with her 4 children. Doris claimed she was not just living in a haunted house. She was being physically and psychologically tormented by unseen forces. These were not mere bumps in the night or fleeting shadows in the corner of her eye. According to her desperate account, these entities were violent, malicious, and their attacks were becoming more frequent and more brutal. She was a woman on the edge, living in a constant state of terror, convinced that invisible assailants were systematically destroying her and her family. For Taff and Gaynor, this was a departure from the typical ghost story. The narrative was raw, deeply personal, and terrifyingly immediate. They agreed to investigate, stepping into a case that would not only challenge their understanding of the paranormal, but would also become one of the most documented and disturbing accounts of a haunting in modern history. A case where the terror was not attached to a place, but to a person. When the investigators arrived at the small, unassuming house on Cota Avenue, they found not a spooky mansion, but a family falling apart from fear. The home was chaotic and cluttered, the air thick with an atmosphere of neglect and despair. At the center of it all was Doris Bither, a woman whose face was a mask of sheer exhaustion and profound terror. Her eyes, wide and haunted, darted around the room as if expecting an attack at any moment. She was a portrait of a person worn down to her very soul. With a trembling voice, Doris recounted her story. A harrowing tale that began subtly but spiraled into an unrelenting nightmare. It started, as many such stories do, with inexplicable phenomena, strange, dancing lights that would appear in the rooms, cold spots that would manifest out of nowhere, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. But soon, the activity escalated with terrifying speed. The unseen forces grew bolder, more aggressive. Pots and pans would be hurled from the kitchen counters, objects would fly across the room with violent force, and the ghostly apparition of an old woman was witnessed by her children, a silent, spectral figure adding to the household's climate of fear. Pooh, however, the most horrific part of her testimony was the claim of repeated, brutal sexual assaults. Doris described being held down and violated by what she perceived as at least 3 separate invisible entities. She believed them to be male spirits, their presence cold and suffocating. The investigators listened, their professional skepticism warring with the palpable fear emanating from Doris and the grim, chaotic state of her home. They were looking at a family under siege, not by a conventional threat, but by something that defied all logical explanation. The investigators' skepticism vanished on the first night. They had set up their equipment in the cramped living room, the atmosphere tense as they waited alongside Doris and her family. For a while, there was nothing but an oppressive silence. The team began to wonder if the phenomena were purely psychological, a manifestation of Doris's troubled life. Then, suddenly, the house came alive with a malevolent energy. Doris's demeanor shifted abruptly. "They're here now," she whispered, her body tensing with dread. The investigators exchanged wary glances, their senses on high alert. Without warning, a lamp on a nearby table was violently thrown across the room, smashing against the far wall. A putrid, foul odor, like that of decaying flesh, permeated the air, causing the investigators to gag. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the team's instruments began to register significant electromagnetic fluctuations. But what made them true believers, what shattered their scientific detachment and plunged them into the heart of the horror, was what happened next. In a darkened corner of the room, a faint greenish mist began to form from thin air. It swirled and eddied, slowly growing in density and size. Before their astonished eyes, the luminous vapor coalesced, taking on the distinct shape of the upper torso of a large, muscular man. The form was semi-transparent but undeniably present, a horrifying specter of green light hanging in the air for a few agonizing moments before it dissipated back into nothingness. In that instant, every doubt was erased. They were not dealing with creaking floorboards or overactive imaginations. They were dealing with something real, something incredibly powerful, and something that was focused intently on Doris Bither. In subsequent investigations, they brought cameras, and they captured astonishing proof. Convinced they were witnessing genuine paranormal phenomena, Taff and Gaynor returned to the Bither house armed with a battery of photographic equipment, including Polaroid and 35mm cameras loaded with high-speed film. Their goal was to document the invisible, to capture on film what their own eyes could barely comprehend. During one particularly intense session, the house erupted into a frenzy of poltergeist activity. As Doris cowered on her bed, screaming that she was being attacked by the entities, the investigators began taking photos constantly, the flash of their cameras strobing in the darkened room, a desperate attempt to catch the phantoms in the act. When they developed the film, the results were stunning. The photos showed the room filled with unexplainable orbs of light, dozens of them, zipping and hovering around Doris. These anomalous lights, they noted, only appeared in the photographs taken during the peak of the paranormal activity. They were not dust particles or lens flares. They moved with apparent intelligence and were captured by multiple cameras from different angles. But the most incredible photograph, the image that would become the definitive evidence of the case, showed a bizarre, static, arcing band of light forming over Doris as she lay on the bed. This was not a moving orb or a fleeting streak. It was a solid, plasma-like ribbon of energy, a luminous bridge that seemed to connect 2 points in the air directly above her. It was captured at the exact moment she claimed she was being held down and assaulted. This photograph, known as the Entity Arc, remains one of the most compelling and controversial pieces of photographic evidence of the paranormal ever recorded. It was a tangible artifact of an intangible assault, a silent testament to the horror Doris Bither was enduring. The investigators began to realize something terrifying. The entities didn't seem to be tied to the house. They were tied to Doris herself. As the investigation deepened, Taff and Gaynor delved into Doris's personal history, searching for clues that might explain the origin of such a violent and personal haunting. Through a series of difficult, emotionally charged interviews, a tragic past came to light. Doris spoke of a life marked by profound trauma, abuse, and hardship. She had been a victim of violence from a young age, and her life as an adult had been a constant struggle, filled with poverty, loss, and pain. A chilling theory began to form in the investigators' minds. What if the haunting wasn't about the property on Kota Avenue at all? The poltergeist activity, the apparitions, and the horrific assaults were all centered exclusively around Doris. The phenomena followed her from room to room. When she left the house, the activity ceased, only to resume upon her return. This wasn't a classic haunted house scenario. The spirits weren't tethered to a location stained by a past tragedy. Instead, they seemed to be drawn to the raw emotional energy of Doris's own past traumas. The investigators theorized that the entities, whatever they were feeding on her pain, her fear, and the dark energy generated by a lifetime of suffering. The story was no longer about a haunted house. It was about a haunted life. Doris was a beacon for these parasitic forces, and her own tragic history had made her a magnet for a horror that was consuming her from the inside out. The very spirits tormenting her may have been constructs of her own psychic energy, given form and malevolence by her anguish. In a last-ditch effort, the investigators helped Doris's family move, hoping that leaving the house would end it all. It was the most logical solution. If the house was the problem, then leaving it behind should provide an escape. With the help of the research team, Doris packed up her few belongings and moved with her children to a new home in a different town. The initial relief was immense. For a few weeks, they had peace. The new house was quiet. There were no strange lights, no disembodied voices, no terrifying assaults in the middle of the night. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, that the nightmare was finally over. Doris began to feel a sliver of hope, a chance at a normal life for herself and her children. But then, it started again. It began with small things, just as before. A pot falling from a shelf in the kitchen when no one was near it. A faint whisper carried on the air when everyone was accounted for. A shadow moving in the periphery of her vision. Doris's heart sank with a familiar, sickening dread. One evening, as she stood alone in her new kitchen, the phenomena returned in full force, a stark confirmation of her deepest fear. A utensil flew off the counter and clattered to the floor. The cold spot returned, enveloping her. The terror was back. The horror wasn't in the address, it was in her. There was no escape. The entities had followed her, proving that the haunting was inextricably and tragically linked to her alone. Leaving the house on Kota Avenue had changed nothing. The prison was not made of wood and plaster. It was woven into the fabric of her very being. The case of Doris Bither. The inspiration for the film The Entity remains one of the most disturbing and unsolved stories in paranormal history. After the move confirmed that the entities were attached to her, the intensive investigation wound down. There was little more the researchers could do. They had documented the phenomena, captured it on film, and confirmed that the source of the haunting was Doris herself. But they had no power to stop it. Doris lived with this torment for years, her life a private, ongoing horror story. She eventually passed away in 1999 from cardiopulmonary failure, her body and spirit finally giving out after a lifetime of struggle and supernatural assault. The mystery of what the entities were demonic forces, poltergeists born from her own psyche, or something else entirely, and why they chose her was never solved. The photographic evidence remains, debated and analyzed to this day, a stark and unsettling glimpse into a terrifying reality. Her case serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most frightening prison isn't a building with four walls, but your own life. It suggests that the ghosts that haunt us are not always external, but can be intrinsically, horrifyingly, a part of who we are.